So I guess if this were all to occur, then we'd expect inflation to continue to go down, and then the Fed to potentially pivot once we see this. Is that, I guess, is that sort of the uh, way that you think it's going to go, or could there be the risk of higher inflation with energy increases and other aspects as well?
Yeah, I think the inflation picture is a little more challenging. Certainly it's more challenging than previous cycles that we've seen. Typically, if you go back to 2020 or '08 or even really 2000, like inflation wasn't really a worry. And so, the Fed was basically able to prioritize growth relative to inflation and ease relatively aggressively when they saw the deterioration in growth conditions. The circumstances today are a little different. Now, of course, inflation has moderated from the peak that it was at, and there are signs that it might is maybe the good way to describe it, might be getting close to where the Fed's target is. But the real question is it durably there? And that really comes down to sort of two core inputs. The first is oil prices. Like inflation is driven by oil. It's kind of amazing, not quite as extreme as in the 70s, but still today, like, if oil prices go up from $3 a gallon or gas prices go up from $3 a gallon to $5 a gallon, there will be inflation, kind of no matter how you slice it. And oil prices have been rising. Uh, it's not been nearly as extreme as right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it's still they're going up, and that is creating an inflationary impulse on the economy. I think the second thing is that determines sort of the structural inflation rate is how nominal wages, are being set relative to the productivity of the employee. The point of which, or the mechanics of this, are relatively straightforward. They're relatively simple, which is basically like, think about how much growth there is in the nominal pay of someone on an hourly basis, and think about how much incrementally are they producing, what their productivity growth is on an hourly basis. And the difference between those two things is essentially what structural inflation is, because what it highlights is the difference between here's how much I'm increasing their pay versus here's how much they're increasing their output. And the difference between those has to be price. It just has to be resolved through price. And I think what we're seeing is there's still a pretty big gap there. Productivity is basically at zero in the U.S. It was that way a bit before COVID, and has been that way after COVID. And nominal wage growth remains relatively elevated, 4, 5, 6%, depending on how you look at it. And in that environment, you're going to have that structural inflation pressure. And so I think you look at those things when you say, sure, measured inflation has improved. That's absolutely true. But what the Fed needs to see is they need to see inflation move durably to their mandate. And I think they've got some real questions about it. I mean, look, Chairman Powell at Jackson Hole was not, doing a tap dance saying the inflation problem's over. We've defeated it. It was actually transitory. All you fools who thought otherwise. Like he soberly described that there were still meaningful risks that inflation could be elevated for an extended period of time above the Fed's target. And that, is a reasonable reflection of the risks that exist, and will drive the Fed to be more prudent and slower moving to ease than what they were in the '08 and 2000 cycles.
Yeah, and it could be the risk of them, they made a mistake in transitory. Maybe they'll make the mistake again in the other way.
Well, I mean, that is the nature of central banks. Central banks are, if they are following what they're supposed to be doing, they will make overshoot errors all the time. In fact, they're almost required by their mandates to overshoot, because what they need to do, if they're doing their job as it's designed, is they take in the information that they can see, and they respond to the information that they can see. And then, of course, what if they're doing their job poorly, they're trying to predict, because they can't predict. They're no good at predicting. That we leave that to the macro savants like ourselves to predict what's going on, right? The Fed doesn't really have that capability. And so they're just internalizing what's happening and responding to what's happening. But inevitably, that's missing. That means that they're not forward looking, which means that they're always playing from behind. and you add in the lags of actually getting the data and then having to see a certain amount of trend in the data before making a decision, and they're handcuffed. They're handcuffed. They must operate essentially in a way where they're behind the curve all the time. Now, that is a problem because essentially they could be more effective in executing their monetary policy. So they create unnecessary swings relative to what would be optimal or ideal policy. But it's also a benefit for those of us trading markets because you got to recognize like the Fed is a big critical actor in the economy, and they're always playing behind. And so they create, overshoots in one direction or the other. And that's fine as long as you know that they're going to create overshoots and you see that might not be priced into financial markets, then that gives you the opportunity for alpha. So, I like to call the Fed's the Fed being behind the curve. It's like a feature and a bug. It's a feature for those of us who trade markets, and it's a bug for making the best economic outcomes that could happen.